Hello and welcome to this presentation on Faustus and the Great Chain of Being. The material in this presentation comes from E.M.W. Tillyard's classic study, The Elizabethan World Picture. And for the next 3 modules, this world picture will be essential to understanding the literature that you will be reading. So, let me take you through the general world picture, specifically the Great Chain of Being, and then we'll end with some discussion of how this might affect your understanding of the tragical history of Dr. Faustus. The Elizabethans, and indeed all of Renaissance Europe, inherited a hierarchical worldview from the medieval culture that it was slowly supplanting. But even though in history books we are taught that there was a sudden transformation from the Middle Ages to the modern ages, as evidenced by the art products of the Renaissance, intellectuals such as Machiavelli, the Reformation led by Luther, Zwingli, and Calvin and others, and of course the rise of science as a method for investigating the natural world, aside from or as opposed to the spiritual world. These changes didn't happen as quickly as history classes sometimes make it appear. They occur very slowly from from an individual perspective. So even though there are intellectual changes occurring during the writing of during Marlowe's lifetime, Shakespeare's lifetime, and even Milton's lifetime, nevertheless, the worldview that they hold to and that gives meaning to their literary works is in fact a modification or simplification of the old medieval worldview. So it's important to know this. So first off, it's important for you to realize that everything in this particular worldview derives from the Bible or from some kind of theological explanation. Even though there are dissenters, it's fair to say that in general, people believe that the cosmos was designed by a benevolent deity. This benevolent deity, God, was considered to be perfection. But you have to understand the notion of perfection. For someone who is versed in Aristotelian philosophy, as the medieval theologians were, and as were Renaissance theologians, perfection indicates a couple of things. It indicates a being or something that does not change at all. It remains changeless. God was seen as something that was changeless. Everything else in the universe changed. So God was more perfect than everything else. As a result, this worldview presents reality as a hierarchy descending from perfection down, from the most perfect to the least perfect. From the most important to the least important, from the most realized, God being complete realization of all possible potential. In other words, God doesn't, all of us have some potential that we'll never realize. God is completely realized potential. Everything that could possibly be said about God, God is. So he is the most realized. On the other hand, when we get further away from God, we're dealing with beings that are less spiritual, less realized, less perfect, um, and to areas where change happens a lot. God is unitary. He is pure in composition. Whereas the further away you get from God, moving towards the earth, you begin to deal with beings that are composite, that are made up of many different parts. So, in order for you to understand this hierarchy, you need to understand this notion of what perfection consisted of and how we have a downward moving cosmos from from most perfect to least perfect. As you might imagine, for Christians of the Renaissance, as just as Christians of the Middle Ages, orderliness is the most important thing. All things have a place. There is a divine order that can be seen in the material and physical world. In general, we can describe the great chain of being in this fashion. At the top of the chain, of course, the highest link in the chain, but also technically outside the chain, is God, the Creator. Below God are spiritual beings, angels, but also demons. These are beings that exist as purely or Holy Spirit. Below them, beings that are both spirit and physical, or that have bodies, and these, of course, are humans, us. We are between angels and, as you can see, in number 5, animals. Now, animals that are animate creatures with only a physical body and 5 senses, but lacking reason. Right? These are non-human mammals, fowl, fish, insects. These come below humans. Then there are those animals that have fewer than 5 senses, or they have inanimate bodies, so people thought, such as oysters, barnacles, mollusks. They are at a lower level. From there, plant life, right? Inanimate, does not move, and it lacks sensory organs, so trees, shrubs, bushes, vegetables. Below animal life is minerals and other inanimate objects. Everything had a place in the hierarchy, and all was well as long as each creature behaved according to its station. So, this is the great chain of being. Now, as I'm about to show you, within each one of these links, there are sublinks. So, among animate creatures with only physical bodies and 5 senses, the lion or the elephant, kind of depends on which particular thing you were dealing with, was considered to be the highest of that particular group, and then within that group you have another little mini chain. Everything is ordered, again, according to its relative perfection in relation to God, who of course is unapproachably perfect. As you might imagine, this is going to have some effects on how the Elizabethans viewed social arrangement and the human body and violations of order. Here we have yet another presentation of the great chain of being. On the left, you can see what I've already shown you. Gods, angels, man, animals, plants, and stones, inanimate objects. But as you can see over to the right, we have the social order of the Middle Ages and also of the Elizabethan period. And the social order also adheres to a hierarchical chain of primacy and importance on downward to, maybe I shouldn't say least important, but least least significant. So we have the king, followed by his aristocrats, and then way down, of course, the peasants. Within the area of the aristocrats, you have a hierarchy of aristocrats. So a duke, then a marquis, then a count, a viscount, a baron, or a lord. And then below them, the lesser aristocrats, knights and gentry, seigneurs, hidalgos, etc. And then within the realm of peasants, as you can see, there are the substantial farmers, the small farmers, the cottagers, the laborers, and then the poor. And of course, the family itself was also hierarchical, with the father being at the top, then the mother, then the male children in birth order, and then the female children in birth order. It should be apparent by now that what has occurred over the course of the 1,000 years of the Middle Ages and what the Elizabethans inherited was was a total vision of complete order. And as with any vision of complete order, if there is a disruption of that order, that's going to create a problem. Now, we've already looked at the chain of being, but there are other chains to consider. Okay, so another very important one that you're probably familiar with, is what's called the Ptolemaic model of the universe. Essentially, this is the Earth-centric model of the universe, but it's important to understand why that particular model, when Copernicus comes up with this idea of putting the sun in the center and not Earth, why that was resisted so thoroughly by people within the church. And it has to do with what we've already been talking about, that the entire cosmology was based upon this idea of a hierarchy. There were reasons why the planets were where they were. So I let me go forward and kind of show it to you right here. As you can see, there's the Earth here in the center, and then each one of these indicates one of the levels of the physical universe. Outside here will be where God is, and then right here we have what's called the primum, or this is the primum mobilum here, the prime mover, and then here we have the realm of the fixed stars. They are more perfect than the planets because they move at a regular passion. They're fixed. They don't change their or alter their patterns. Planets do. They generally move in the same direction, but there are times when they enter something called retrograde, where they seem to slow down, back up, and then go forward again. Of course, that has to do, we know now, with the relative motion of the Earth to those other planets. That occasionally, based upon how the Earth is moving in relation to the planets, there are going to be periods where they seem to, quote unquote, back up. But in the Middle Ages and in the Renaissance, when the belief was that the Earth was at the center, the planets simply did. For them, there was some kind of irregular motion. So while the motion of the planets is generally fixed, there are times when it varies. So they are imperfect. The more the variation, the greater the imperfection. Therefore, we go from Saturn on down to the moon. And then below the moon, of course, at the center of everything is the earth. Now, by now, you probably have figured out that to be at the center of this particular cosmos is not the best place to be. You want to be, because being at the center is also being at the bottom. So, what we have here is the Ptolemaic universe seen as a decreasing level of perfection, with the earth being that most imperfect of celestial bodies. Now, the medieval thinkers, the medieval world, inherited from the classical world the belief in four basic elements. Those are earth, air, fire, water. Fire, in other words, all things are made up of a relative combination of these four substances. So fire is, now of course, here we go, right? The substances themselves are also arrayed in terms of perfection, from the most spiritual, the most complete, the most unitary, to the one to those that are the least spiritual. So fire, as you might imagine, is higher than all of the other elements. It is the closest to heavenly matter, and it is also the most volatile. From there, we have air, which is a second-ranking element. It is not as high as fire, but it is higher than water and earth. Then, of course, there's water, and then finally earth, which is the most stable, but it's the basest and lowest element. Now, you might ask yourself, well, why is it that fire appears here on Earth, and that we don't actually have fire and air and water and earth? Why are they mixed up as opposed to separate, like all of the other heavenly bodies? Well, because, as we'll talk about in a moment, original sin, human sin, altered or corrupted the order, the natural order of things. And so, instead of everything being in its place below what's called the sublunary realm, that realm below the moon, Luna, instead of everything having its proper place, things are all mixed up. And that's kind of the nature of human life as well. Things are all mixed up. We'll address that in a little bit. Now then, when we talk about the human body itself, then we have to talk about what are referred to as the humors. The humors, the word comes from the Latin for fluid. The belief was that there were four fluids that affected the health and well-being of each individual. Those fluids were yellow bile, black bile, blood, and phlegm. And as long as these fluids were existed in the body in equal proportions, then all was well. However, if there was too much of one of these particular fluids or humors, then that would have a psychological and physical effect on the body. So, as you can see, if you have too much yellow bile, you suffer something called choler, which is an irritability or anger. If you have too much black bile, tears. Um, then you have melancholy. You have sadness. You're depressed. If you have an excess of blood, then you are overly excited. You are um, overly energetic. You are hyper, so to speak. You are, perhaps more sexually aroused than you should be. And then if you were phlegmatic, if you have excessive phlegm, then you are lethargic, bored. It leads to inaction, fatigue, and sleepiness. So as you can see, each one of these fluids is actually a manifestation of some psychological feature within our minds, and their explanation was that the behavior of the physical body affected, of course, the behavior of the mind. Because the idea was that we were equal parts body and spirit, a kind of mixed being. We're higher than the animals because we have spirit. We're lower than the angels because we have body. But what affects the body affects the mind. What affects the mind affects the body. So as you can see with the with blood and with this thing here, although the practice of bleeding, which is something that continued into the 19th century, if you can believe it, that is one of the causes of George Washington's death. Excessive bleeding. The practice of using leeches or of piercing and sucking blood out, the practice of bleeding was an accepted medical practice to address what was believed to be a cause of ailment, that there was too much blood and therefore you needed to remove some of the blood to balance out the humors. But again, it's important to remember how everything has a place. Everything has to have a harmonic balance, and the balance in one area, such as the body, can affect the balance in all the other areas as well. And that's where we're headed in this little presentation. So it's important to remember that all of creation is bound together. What affects one thing affects other things in the chain of being. This is what was referred to as a correspondence. And so we're going to talk a little bit now about varying correspondences. We can think of these correspondences as interlocking chains. And these interlocking chains are the macrocosm, which is the universe, nature, the skies, the microcosm, which is the human body, which itself is a kind of map of the universe. What is true, that the human body itself corresponds in structure and in internal relationships to the universal body, so to speak. And then, of course, the body politic. That's the social organization of human society. So the microcosm, that's the human body, our individual selves. Again, it connects to every part of creation. Everything is related to everything else. One thing affects another. The body is a little world. That's a metaphor that Elizabethan poets, Shakespeare, of course, included, use very often. The humans were considered to be created in God's own image, and they're set at the very center of creation and given a primary position or primate position over the animals in general. That's why, in fact, not just the animals, but also the plants and everything below humans in the great chain. This was, of course, justified by God's commandment to Adam and Eve that they have charge of all the animals and all the plants, etc. They named them, and they are caretakers or beneficiaries, however you choose to interpret that. So what happens if there's an imbalance? Well, when the humors are balanced proportionately in the human body, mankind is healthy and experiences no negative and inappropriate emotions. But if there is unbalance, it leads to disease. But it can also lead to civil disorder, disorder within society, the body politic, and it can lead to a disorder in nature. And you hear about this in Shakespeare, where, for example, when Macbeth kills Duncan, the king, there are reports about earthquakes and other kinds of cosmic disturbances and disturbances in the vegetative and in the animal world. For example, famously, Duncan's horses eat each other. That's as it's reported, and and the belief here is that if one hierarchy among the correspondences in the great chain of being is disrupted, it is going to have a ripple effect on the others. The ultimate disorder, of course, is sin. The original sin, which is the sin of pride, was Satan's sin, but it's also arguably the sin of Adam and Eve, because to eat of the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil is to be as like God. So the desire to know good and evil, though when we get to someone like someone like Milton, he will say, for example, that the knowing good and evil was a necessary or happy fall for humans, because they were able then to be saved by Christ, but also to make their own choice, knowing good and ill, to choose good over ill. Whereas Adam and Eve didn't know any better. They didn't know the difference, and so they behaved in an innocent fashion. However, that original transgression created disorder within all of reality, within the entire great chain of being. Now, the term sublunary, or beneath the moon, is a frequent image in Elizabethan literature, and it again refers to the state of affairs of human life and of physical life here on Earth, and in the realm below the moon. And there's only one place below the moon, and that is, of course, Earth. So, what original sin does is to produce decay in the sublunary sphere. It becomes an area where the world is changing, and change is, of course, imperfect, and change leads to a lot of unpleasant things. Old age, death, erosion, disease, rain, wind, weather, rust and decay, entropy. All of these things were viewed as being negative. They were a kind of wasting away of being. All things are wasted away. And if that sounds a little bit like the Wanderer, no surprise there. Okay, the Wanderer and the Wanderer poet, and that from that sort of more pessimistic Anglo-Saxon perspective, this is the world that they saw. Now, when we get to the High Middle Ages with Chaucer, etc., there's a there's a different view of the world. There's a more optimistic view of the world. But this is still what we have to wrestle with. So how is it that the Great Chain still works? Well, even though there are pieces that are missing, there are enough pieces remaining for it to function. The trick is that every creature has to know its duty and its place in the chain and act accordingly. Now, I don't need to tell you what the implications are for that, but I will tell you anyway. All things have to know their places. So to go back to our hierarchy, and that's what we're really wanting to emphasize here, that there is an elaborate and interconnected hierarchical structure to reality, and this is the backdrop for all of the literature that we're going to be reading, really, I would argue, for the rest of the semester. The term primate refers to that person or that being that's higher on the chain and has more spiritual aspects and a greater capacity for rationality, or is closer in likeness to God. So again, there are three, the correspondence is on three levels. Again, microcosm, macrocosm, body politic, with God being, of course, the supreme primate, not, again, a primate in the sense of like apes and humans and things like that. Primate as the head of the chain or of a section of the chain. So he is the king of angels. Below God are the angelic beings, and the angelic beings are organized in a hierarchy of 7 choirs. So within the realm of angels, there is a hierarchy itself. Just like within the realm of humans, there is a hierarchy. So angels, and then archangels, and virtues, powers, principalities, dominations, Ophanium, sorry about that, cherubim, and seraphim. You've heard some of these terms before. Now you know. Why there are different terms, because there are different levels, different degrees of angelicness. And of course, Satan, who was an angel, sought to be higher than this particular realm. He sought to be in the same realm as God. So he is the first person to violate the great chain of being. The human realm is next, and of course the primate of the human realm would be the king, followed by the nobility. They have the right to rule, which was given by God, could only be removed by him. And there was a belief that the king had superior virtue, wisdom, grace, and strength, and that though the nobility had those qualities, they had them in less degree than the king. And of course, whatever those qualities, the laity, or not the laity, the common person had, they would have in less degree as well. Are you seeing what's going on here? Now, you have below the king, right? You have the 3 estates. You have the bellatores, which are the knights, and the royalty who fight and rule, protecting the physical health of God's flock. The oratores, which are the clergy, the priests who pray and tend to the spiritual needs of God's flock. And then the labores, those who work, the farmers, the serfs who feed God's flock. Notice each one of them has a role to play, not just in the physical, not just in the social or civic or political realm. They have a role to play in the spiritual realm as well. And they must all remain in their place, and they must all do their job. And if anyone breaks this hierarchy, terrible things will result. Below the human realm, of course, are the realm of the beasts, right? The noble beasts are those that are most are most animate and have the five senses. So among beasts, the primate is either the lion or the elephant. I've mentioned that before. But even within the animal realm, there is a hierarchy of animals, and they're really in each of these realms. I don't have time to go into it, but within the animal realm, there is a hierarchy. Within the plant realm, there's a hierarchy. Within the mineral realm, there is a hierarchy as well. So we get to the mineral realm, and as you might imagine, diamonds were the mineral primate, with other gems below them. But even something inanimate like dirt or stone has a place, has a purpose, has a unique gift within this realm of the great chain of being. So all things have their place, and the goodness of all things is determined by their place. And the goodness, that's it. So what are the ethical, political ramifications, but also literary ramifications? First, it's important to know one's place and not seek to rise above it through unholy ambition. And you get the sense now that to want to rise above your station in society, for example, is by nature an unholy ambition. Equally important, you need to know your place. You need to not sink below it by neglecting your duties, but you need to fulfill your duties. That's right. Let me try that again. So you don't want ambition to cause you to seek to rise above your position, but you don't want to neglect the responsibilities and duties of your position so that you sink below your station, right? And again, it's important to balance the physical and animal needs of the body with divine reason. And then we're not going to get into that last point there. But what is important to remember is that all things have their purpose, because all things have their place, and all things' responsibilities involve fulfilling the responsibilities of their particular position. And if everyone does that, if everything does that, if every being, if every humor, if every peasant or knight or lord or planet, they all do what they're supposed to do according to their position in the hierarchy, everything will be great. With this in mind, let's turn our attention to the tragical history of Dr. Faustus. And I have a number of questions that I would like for you to think about in relation to the form in this module. First off, let's ask this question: is the Elizabethan worldview oppressive? Let's think about it from a historical perspective. If what I've said is true, and let's take the cosmic order the Ptolemaic universe. If it is true that all heavenly bodies, that the stars, the planets, um, and then the planets, of course, also include the moon and the earth. All of these have their place, and they all need to fulfill their responsibilities of place. Then, if you decide to move Earth up in this hierarchy, you are completely breaking the order of the universe, of the physical universe. The cosmic order has been disrupted, and therefore we can no longer consider Earth to be that point most imperfect and most and most removed from the realm of God, the realm of perfection, the realm of completeness and wholeness. If that's the case, then that breaks down the entire hierarchical structure of the cosmos, of the solar system, or the known universe. If that's the case, then that means that that there are going to be ramifications because remember because of the theory of correspondence. If there is a disruption in that realm, then there's going to be a disruption in the microcosm and in the body politic as well, and that's going to produce all kinds of chaos for human life. So, as you can see, this kind of model of reality discourages a person from seeking more information about reality, specifically, well, the information of science, for example. Furthermore, I mean, is there really any need to do any kind of scientific research? The only reason why you would want to engage in scientific exploration or scientific examination is if on some level you didn't accept that model in the first place, which already looks a little like the sin of pride. Right? So think about this. In this kind of worldview, which is, I have to admit, it's a beautifully articulated worldview, but within this worldview, there really is only a limited room for exploration, right? For research into the nature of things. For example, if we're looking at Faustus, on one hand, of course, it's easy to say, well, yeah, Faustus, he makes a deal with the devil, so he needs to be condemned, he needs to be damned. On the other hand, what if the play is presenting to us a situation where we're asked to consider the limitations of what a person could learn, what there was to know within that old worldview, and then determine, is Faustus perhaps a hero because he seeks to go beyond the limited knowledge and limited structures of the Elizabethan worldview? Put another way, Marlowe presents to us a story about a man who seeks to learn more than the society that he is a part of is willing to allow him to. Should he be punished for that or not? There's no real answer to that question, but it is something that I think is worth exploring and thinking about. Any kind of exploration for new knowledge would be seen from the perspective of this great chain of being as wanting to be more like God, wanting to be above your station, wanting to question this hierarchical structure of everything. So I don't know. On one level, it could be simply a good old-fashioned mystery play or morality play, in which a man seeks to go after forbidden knowledge, and is punished for it because he has exceeded the limits of his station. On the other hand, you could see it as the result of a society, if you see it from that perspective, a society that whose structure, whose intellectual structure, is resists any kind of questioning. That really is up to you to determine, and you don't even have to think about that if you don't want to. There are others as well, but you but you may also, along those lines, ask yourself the question: does the Elizabethan worldview sacrifice change for order? You could also put it: does it sacrifice progress for stability? That's a very interesting question. To what degree, because we all want stability and order, we need it, but to what degree are we willing to sacrifice change or innovation in order to maintain that order or stability? Because you know what happens when change or innovation occurs. The old order or stability is shaken. Along the same lines, all right, Faust has, or Faustus, I should say. Faustus has some choices at the beginning of the play that he can, of areas that he can pursue: medicine, theology, analytics, philosophy. There are various realms that are open to him as a person of his station, meaning as a human being and a Christian and a scholar. None of those are satisfactory to him. So, along the lines of what I asked earlier, here's another important question. Is it important, is it better to fulfill one's potential, or is it better to fulfill one's role? Now, remember, we talked about God as being the complete realization of potential. That is one of his perfections. So other beings below him on the chain have less potential and also less ability to fulfill their potential. So on one level, it if you see it from the old order, fulfilling one's role is to fulfill one's potential, because that's all one's potential is one's role. However, you know from your own life that this kind of thinking means that if you're born as a laborer, then your job is to be a laborer, and you should not dream to be something more than that. But should you? My assumption is that since you are all in college, and since a lot of you are coming from backgrounds in which your parents or most of your family did not go to college, that the old station that your family has occupied is not satisfying to you. That you believe you have a potential that you would like to fulfill, and it goes beyond the role that you we're born into. And again, it's tricky to discuss these things with people from American society where we don't have that kind of fixed hierarchical thinking. We grow up believing that anybody can be anything. Anybody can become president. Anybody can become rich, right? Which, of course, are our kinds of hierarchies. So, something else to consider as well. And then finally, why does Faustus not repent? He has a number of opportunities. He even has arguments made to him on behalf of repentance by an angel, by an old man, um, by colleagues, and yet he doesn't do it. Some people speculate that this exhibits some of the influence of Calvin and his and an interpretation of his belief in predetermination or predestination, that your fate, your spiritual fate, your end, your telos, has already been determined. Um, maybe it's been predetermined that Faustus must be damned, and that his repentance won't make a difference in the long run. Maybe there's another reason why. Maybe Faustus does not trust in repentance. Maybe I'm going to come up with some ridiculous things. I mean, maybe he's embarrassed. Nobody likes to admit they're wrong. Right? A lot of people will go to great lengths and great embarrassment and ruination of themselves and other people simply not to admit that they have been wrong. Maybe that's Faustus. Ultimately, there are no answers to these questions. But for your form this week, which is the only assignment dealing with Faustus, instead of giving you a specific prompt, I'm asking you to consider these or other questions, or anything that I've brought up in this discussion, and select an idea that you would like to explain to us about what you've gotten out of the reading of Faustus. I'm less concerned with formal the formal qualities of your writing in this particular form. I'm not even necessarily concerned about citations and things of that nature. I'm much more concerned about hearing what you think. I want to learn something from you this week. So please, speak your mind.